It started with a routine media appearance. Donald Trump, surrounded by reporters outside his Florida estate, took questions with his usual bravado. At first, the conversation revolved around the ongoing legal cases against him, upcoming campaign events, and his opinions on the state of the country. But then, the tone shifted. A reporter mentioned a recent committee hearing in which Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett had challenged Republican narratives with assertive questioning. Her name, barely out of the reporter's mouth, seemed to ignite something. Asterisk with narrowed eyes and a slight sneer. Trump launched into a tirade. He dismissed her as a disgrace to Congress, accusing her of being loud, disrespectful, and dangerous. But then came the part that shocked many even seasoned political observers. In front of cameras, without hesitation, he said, "Frankly, someone like her should be investigated, maybe even jailed." Asterisk it wasn't a slip of the tongue. It was a pointed, deliberate statement that landed with the weight of a threat. The idea that a former president and current presidential candidate would openly suggest imprisoning a sitting member of Congress for questioning his record was unheard of in modern American politics. Within minutes, the clip was making rounds online, spreading across Twitter, YouTube, and national media outlets. Asterisk journalists scrambled to make sense of what they'd just witnessed. The White House issued a brief statement condemning any threat against elected officials, though it didn't name Trump directly. Legal analysts were quick to weigh in, pointing out that while the statement didn't carry any immediate legal weight, it hinted at authoritarian leanings that no democracy could afford to ignore. Some even went as far as to say the remark bordered on a violation of democratic norms and could be interpreted as an attempt to intimidate lawmakers from speaking out. Asterisk for those who had followed Jasmine Crockett's rise in Congress, the targeting wasn't entirely surprising. She had built a reputation for asking tough questions, particularly in committee hearings involving oversight and justice. Her background as a civil rights attorney gave her a commanding presence during legal discussions, and she never shied away from confronting narratives she saw as misleading or dishonest. Her commentary often went viral, sometimes praised, sometimes criticized, but always unapologetically candid. Asterisk still, even for her most ardent supporters, this was different. The threat wasn't veiled, it was overt. The statement wasn't just meant to discredit her, it was intended to silence her, and the implications of that were deeply unsettling. Asterisk reporters reached out to members of both parties for their reactions. Most Republicans declined to comment. A few tried to downplay the statement, suggesting it was just rhetoric or part of Trump's usual bombastic style. But the discomfort was visible behind closed doors. Staffers admitted that the comment had crossed a line. Asterisk Democrats were swift and unified in their response. Several members of Congress issued statements defending Crockett and condemning the threat. Some even suggested that Trump's words could be construed as an abuse of influence, especially considering his ongoing ambitions to return to power. "We don't threaten to jail members of Congress because we disagree with them," one senior House Democrat said on MSNBC. "That's not leadership, it's tyranny." Asterisk meanwhile, constitutional scholars were being interviewed across major networks, warning about the long-term damage such rhetoric could cause to public trust in democratic institutions. If elected officials began to fear retribution simply for doing their jobs, especially by way of criminal threats, what would that say about the balance of power in the United States? Asterisk the reaction wasn't limited to political or legal circles. Civil rights organizations, grassroots movements, and community leaders across the country began to speak out. They noted that Crockett's identity as a black woman in a position of authority made the threat even more charged. It tapped into a long, painful history of black leaders being targeted when they refused to stay quiet. Asterisk this wasn't just another political jab. This was something deeper, something more dangerous. It forced the country to reckon with the disturbing question: was this what the future of American politics looked like, where dissenting voices would be met, not with debate, but with threats of incarceration? As soon as the clip of Donald Trump suggesting that Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett should be investigated or jailed went viral, it was clear a response was coming, but few anticipated just how quickly and how powerfully Crockett would reclaim the narrative. Asterisk within hours of the clip hitting major news outlets and social media platforms, her team confirmed that she would be speaking directly to the public. Rather than rely solely on press statements or interviews, Crockett chose a more personal approach, standing before a modest crowd at a community center in South Dallas. With local supporters and activists gathered behind her, she faced the cameras. There was no anger in her voice, no theatrics. Instead, she addressed the comment with the kind of clarity and composure that turned the moment into something larger than political pushback. It became a stand for principle. Asterisk, she began by laying out the facts. She had not been accused of any crime, had not broken any laws, and had merely exercised her duty as a member of Congress during oversight hearings. "Let me be clear," she said firmly. "What I said in that hearing was based on facts, evidence, and a responsibility to the American people. I did my job. I asked the hard questions. That's not criminal. That's accountability." Asterisk, she then pivoted directly to Trump's comments, saying, "No former president, no man, no matter how wealthy, powerful, or loud, has the right to threaten elected officials simply for speaking truth. We do not jail people in this country for disagreeing with a former president. That's not democracy. That's dictatorship." The crowd responded with quiet applause, not the rowdy cheers of a campaign rally, but the kind of affirming, grounded support that comes from people who understood the gravity of what was happening. Her statement struck a chord online almost instantly. Clips from her speech circulated on X, formerly Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube, often accompanied by the hashtag #StandWithCrockett. People from across the political spectrum, especially those concerned with protecting democratic norms, began to share her message. Her tone throughout the address wasn't one of personal grievance, but of institutional concern. She emphasized that this wasn't just about her, but about setting a precedent. If I can be threatened today for holding a president accountable, then what stops someone else from being jailed tomorrow for voting the wrong way, or for writing an article that speaks the truth? She asked. This wasn't the first time she had faced criticism or attacks. Crockett was well aware of the challenges that came with being a black woman in American politics, but this moment felt different. It wasn't about criticism, it was about intimidation, and she wasn't going to allow that to pass without response. Behind the scenes, her team had already begun coordinating with legal experts, civil rights leaders, and members of Congress to assess whether Trump's remarks could constitute an improper attempt to interfere with congressional duties. Though it was unlikely that any legal action would be taken directly from the comment, it was a stark reminder of the need for safeguards, both legal and institutional, to protect lawmakers from political threats. In interviews following the speech, Crockett expanded on her concerns. She said she worried about the broader implications for junior members of Congress, especially women. Especially people of color who might second-guess speaking out in future hearings. "If this is what comes with the job now," she said on CNN, "we're in trouble." Even more telling was how her response seemed to galvanize support not just from her base, but from a growing coalition of moderates and even some conservatives, who saw Trump's comment as a dangerous overreach. Several Republican commentators called the statement irresponsible and un-American, noting that disagreement with elected officials should be addressed through debate, not threats. For Crockett, this wasn't about boosting her profile or seizing a political moment. It was about affirming something basic, that members of Congress are elected to serve, to question, to investigate, and to represent the people without fear of being personally targeted by former or current presidents. Her decision to speak out, directly and publicly, served not only as a rebuttal to Trump's threat, but as a reminder to the country that intimidation has no place in a functioning democracy. The response to Donald Trump's comments about jailing Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett didn't just end with her public rebuttal. It ignited a national conversation that quickly spiraled beyond partisan politics. The legal community, civil rights organizations, and everyday citizens began examining the constitutional and ethical implications of such a statement, and the consensus was swift. Trump had crossed a line that should never be blurred in a democratic society. Legal experts from across the country took to television and online platforms to explain just how dangerous the precedent would be if Trump's words were left unchallenged. Prominent constitutional scholars noted that Crockett, as a sitting member of Congress, is protected by the speech or debate clause in the U.S. Constitution. This clause explicitly shields lawmakers from legal action for things said in the course of their official duties, particularly during committee hearings or on the House floor. Trump's suggestion that she should be jailed for doing her job, they argued, wasn't just politically charged, which constitutionally absurd. On MSNBC, one former federal prosecutor said, "This is not a gray area. This is black and white. You cannot jail a member of Congress for asking tough questions in a hearing. That's called oversight. That's called governance." Another legal analyst on CNN emphasized that Trump's statement bordered on an abuse of influence. "It's deeply troubling to hear a former president, and a likely nominee, speak in terms that resemble authoritarian regimes where opposition voices are punished." Meanwhile, civil rights organizations such as the NAACP, the ACLU, and smaller grassroots collectives issued statements of support for Crockett and concern over the potential normalization of political intimidation. The ACLU wrote, "Threatening to imprison a public servant for fulfilling their constitutional role is incompatible with the values of a free society." Many of these groups pointed out that such statements are not only about the individual being targeted, but also serve as warning signals to others who might consider challenging those in power. Social media added fuel to the fire. Commentators across X and Instagram began drawing parallels to historical moments, where democratic erosion began with casual threats against lawmakers or journalists. The idea that a former president could threaten jail for a member of Congress without evidence, due process, or legal groundings sent chills down the spines of those who still believe in the rule of law. Interestingly, Even some conservative, legal thinkers who often remained silent during controversies involving Trump spoke out. A few published opinion pieces arguing that while Trump may have been venting, the language he used was unacceptable for someone seeking public office again. One Republican-appointed judge wrote in a widely shared blog post, "When a leader speaks about jailing opponents, especially elected ones, we enter a territory that should concern every American, regardless of party." This moment also sparked renewed discussion on how to protect elected officials from intimidation. Lawmakers began considering whether ethics rules or even legislation should be strengthened to discourage similar threats in the future. One member of Congress proposed a resolution affirming the constitutional protections of legislative speech and condemning attempts to coerce or silence members through public threats. Crockett's supporters and even neutral observers pointed out that her actions during the committee hearing in question were standard congressional oversight. She had raised concerns, asked questions, and challenged testimony, just as her role required. Trump's reaction was not to offer a counterpoint or refute her claims, but instead to publicly float the idea of incarceration, an alarming escalation that alarmed institutions far beyond Capitol Hill. As the backlash grew, Trump's allies attempted to clean up the remarks, claiming he was simply being rhetorical or misunderstood, but the damage was already done. In a political climate already strained by polarization, his statement reminded the public that political intimidation, especially when it threatens core democratic functions, must never be dismissed as mere theater. Through it all, one thing that became clear: the protections built into the U.S. Constitution are not just ceremonial, they are essential. And when those protections are threatened, especially by someone who has held the highest office in the land, it is the responsibility of institutions, experts, and citizens alike to speak out in defense of the principles that hold democracy together. What Donald Trump may have intended as a way to intimidate Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett ended up having the opposite effect. Rather than weaken her resolve or damage her reputation, his public threat propelled her into the national spotlight. Within days of his remarks, Crockett's name was trending on social media, not because she was under investigation or facing scandal, but because she had become a symbol of strength in the face of political intimidation. Support for her surged across digital platforms, and it wasn't just her typical base reacting. People who had never heard of her before were suddenly paying attention to her speeches, her committee performances, and her past legal work. Clips of her calmly but confidently dismantling witnesses in oversight hearings began to resurface online, often captioned with phrases like "this is who he's afraid of" and "truth speaks louder than threats." Donations to her campaign skyrocketed. According to her team, within 72 hours of Trump's statement, Crockett's re-election fundraising experienced a record-breaking bump. Thousands of individual donors, many contributing small amounts, sent messages along with their donations, thanking her for not backing down. It was a financial and symbolic show of support that demonstrated how Trump's attempt to discredit her had completely misfired. But Crockett didn't simply accept the momentum, she used it. Understanding the weight of the moment, she immediately began organizing meetings with colleagues on both sides of the aisle to address the bigger issue: what happens when political leaders threaten elected officials with prosecution for doing their jobs. From those conversations came the early framework for a resolution aimed at reaffirming congressional protections and denouncing political threats against lawmakers. Though, the resolution was largely symbolic and lacked bipartisan traction. It sent a clear message: attempts to intimidate members of Congress would not be tolerated, and the legislative branch would not remain silent in the face of such behavior. While it didn't pass, the proposal sparked a series of hearings and op-eds about the fragility of democratic norms when powerful figures attempt to blur the lines between dissent and criminality. Her colleagues took note. Even lawmakers who often disagreed with her politically began acknowledging the importance of her stand. One moderate Democrat told Politico, "You don't have to agree with her politics to respect what she did. When someone threatens your voice, your duty is to speak louder," and that's exactly what Jasmin did. She was invited onto major television shows, from CNN to MSNBC, to discuss not just the threat itself, but what it meant for the future of congressional independence. On air, she was thoughtful, focused, and consistently turned the conversation back to the American people, reminding viewers that if elected leaders could be silenced, then so could the constituents they represent. In a particularly powerful interview, she said, "If he's willing to threaten me for holding him accountable, imagine what he'd do to someone without a title or platform. This isn't about myths, about protecting the rights of every citizen who depends on Congress to speak truth to power." Her calm, defiance, and continued focus on democratic principles resonated. Civic groups and university political science departments began citing the situation in lectures and discussions about political pressure and institutional resilience. Commentators referred to the episode as a case study in how public officials can effectively respond to political intimidation without sinking to the level of personal attacks. Even internationally, Media outlets picked up the story. European and Canadian newspapers covered the exchange as a cautionary tale about political polarization in the United States. Some foreign commentators praised Crockett for maintaining composure in the face of what they described as authoritarian-style rhetoric from a former U.S. president. Asterisk, as the news cycle gradually moved forward, one lasting impression remained. The effort to silence her had amplified her voice. Trump's comments may have been intended to send a message, but the one the public heard was far different. Jasmine Crockett didn't retreat or deflect. She responded with transparency, poise, and resolve, and in doing so, became not just a defender of herself, but of the very role of Congress in a democratic society. Asterisk. The clash between Donald Trump and Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett wasn't just a passing political flare pit, became a defining moment in a much larger conversation about democracy, accountability, and the limits of power in America. What began as a troubling remark from a former president, a threat to jail a sitting member of Congress for simply doing her job, evolved into a national reflection on the very foundation of representative government. Asterisk, in an era where political rhetoric often spirals into division, Crockett's response stood out. She didn't match hostility with hostility. Instead, she chose clarity over chaos, facts over fear. Her decision to face the public directly, to speak calmly and truthfully about her role and responsibilities, reminded many Americans of what leadership should look like, especially in the face of threats. She didn't try to turn the moment into a political weapon, but rather used it as a teaching point, urging the nation to consider how fragile democracy becomes when dissent is treated as criminal behavior. Asterisk, Trump's words, while shocking, were not entirely unprecedented. His political style has long been confrontational and marked by a willingness to push boundaries. But this time, the target was not a rival candidate or a news outlet, it was a lawmaker, protected under the Constitution, carrying out her duties on behalf of the people. The difference was not just legal, but symbolic. It represented an attempt or not to blur the lines between power and law, between opinion and intimidation. Asterisk, the public's reaction was swift and clear. Americans from all walks of life recognized what was at stake, not just the career of one congresswoman, but the principle that elected officials must be free to hold the powerful accountable without fear of retribution. Civic leaders, legal scholars, media commentators, and ordinary citizens came together, not in partisan fury, but in collective agreement that certain lines should never be crossed. Asterisk. Crockett's rise from the moment speaks to something deeper. The resilience of democratic values when defended boldly and ethically. Her ability to turn a threat into an opportunity for public engagement and education demonstrates the kind of leadership that transcends political party or ideology. It's the kind of leadership that reassures Americans that while the system may be tested, it is not yet broken. Asterisk, the story of this moment is not just about Trump or Crockett. It's about every citizen who believes in the right to speak freely, question authority, and expect integrity from public service. In standing tall when it mattered most, Crockett showed that courage and clarity still have a place in American politics. And perhaps, more importantly, she reminded the country that democracy endures not just through laws and institutions, but through the people who are willing to defend it loudly when necessary, and firmly